March 16th, 1984. Baton Rouge Metropolitan Airport. The terminal hums with the ordinary rolling suitcases, distant announcements, the low murmur of travelers passing through. Near a bank of payphones, a man in a white baseball cap and aviator sunglasses stands quietly. Just a man on a phone making a call. But he's waiting. It's 9:30 p.m. Moments later, a dark-haired man in an orange sweater enters the terminal escorted by law enforcement, trailed by local news cameras. Everything about this feels routine until it isn't. As the group passes, the man on the phone turns, and in one swift motion, he raises a gun and pulls the trigger. A single shot echoes through the terminal. Chaos erupts. Officers tackle him almost instantly. The cameras keep rolling as the voices shout over each other. "Gary, why? Why, Gary?" The shooter doesn't run. He doesn't fight, because everyone there already knows who he is. His name is Gary Plauché, and there has never been any doubt about what he did. But for decades, one question has divided a country. Was this murder, or was it justice? I'm Brittany Ransom, and this is When Killers Get Caught, a podcast where I examine the people, the psychology, and the moments that lead to the most extreme acts of violence, and what happens when the truth finally catches up. Before we go any further, I want to give a content warning. This episode discusses child sexual abuse. This is a story about a father, his son, and the moment a private act of pain and rage became public forever. Before the headlines, before the footage, before that moment in the airport, Gary Plauché was just a dad. He lived with his family in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, part of a solid middle-class life that from the outside looked pretty ordinary. Gary was known as a hardworking man, protective, involved, the kind of dad who showed up despite his busy job in heavy equipment sales. His wife, June, held the family together in quieter ways, present, attentive, deeply devoted to their children. Together, they were raising a full house, 3 boys and a girl, Jennifer, Gary, June, Joseph, a.k.a. Jody, and Mikey. Each with their own personalities, their own routines, their own noise filling the home. But like a lot of families, there was something that brought them all together, something structured, something positive. Karate. It wasn't just an after-school activity, it became part of their world. Discipline, confidence, respect, those were the values tied to it. And for their son, Jody, it was more than just a hobby. He was deeply involved, spending long hours training, learning, and improving. And that's where the family met Jeffrey Doucette. Doucette wasn't just an instructor. He was someone the family trusted, someone who had access, someone who over time positioned himself not just as a teacher, but as a mentor in Jody's life. And that's what made everything that came next so devastating. Because nothing about the Plauché family suggested what was about to unfold. There were no warning signs loud enough, no moments that could have prepared them for how quickly normal could collapse into something unthinkable. At this moment, they were just a family. A father doing his best, a mother holding things together, and a kid chasing something he loved. And they had no idea how much that trust would cost them. That word, trust, it stood for structure, familiarity, safety. And it's exactly what Jeff Doucette used to cause harm. Doucette was embedded in the Plauché lives. He'd been every other child's karate coach in the family before Jody, but he took a special liking to Jody. He was a mentor to the 11-year-old, and the Plauché family trusted him completely. He spoke in the language of discipline, of encouragement, of guidance, and he used that to get very close to Jody. At first, it just looked like attention, extra coaching, more time at practice, the kind of investment any parent might feel grateful for. But that attention slowly shifted into something else, something isolating. Doucette began creating opportunities to be alone with Jody, offering him rides, inviting him over, inviting himself over to family events, blurring the lines between teacher and something much more personal. That's how grooming works, and we know that it started when Jody was 10, sometime in 1983. In his own autobiography, Jody explained that alone, Jeff started to test boundaries with him. He said Jeff would go, "We need to stretch," so he'd be touching around my legs. That way, if he grabbed my private area, he could say, "It was an accident, we were just trying to stretch." Or if we were driving in his car, he'd put his hand in my lap and might go, "I didn't mean to. I didn't realize my hands were there." That's that slow, gradual seduction. After months of flirting with crossing the line, Jeff did molest Jody. By that point, Jody was already caught in something, though, that he didn't fully understand. Jody said that he knew the touching was wrong and that Jeff's insistence on trying to give Jody oral sex was also wrong, but he still felt some kind of emotional responsibility to his big brother, Jeffrey. He was caught between knowing he needed to tell his parents. His mom and dad had always talked to him about the bad people who hurt children, but there was just this mental block. Jody said, "I knew that he was the one that had something wrong with him." But he kept silent, like so many children do. From the outside, it might not have seemed like this could get any worse, but it did. By this point, Jeff wasn't just manipulating Jody, he was manipulating the entire family. Because grooming doesn't just happen to a child, it can happen to everyone around them too. Jeff Doucette had spent an entire year building trust with the Plauchés. He was reliable, helpful, familiar, the kind of person who made himself useful, offering rides, spending extra time, becoming someone the family didn't even question. He maintained a split life, though. See, to the Plauchés, he was the perfect teacher and big brother. But to Jody, he shared intimate details about his life, how he was in debt and trying to get money to pay it off, that if he couldn't, he was going to leave town. And he told Jody ahead of time, "If I have to leave, I'm going to take you with me." Jody didn't know when, but after learning that detail, he said he almost told his parents, but he was still too scared. And then on February 14th, 1984, Jeff took it a step further. Jeff told June that he was going to take Jody on a short drive. He told Jody they were going to look at a carpet his brother was going to install in a new house being built. And they did stop by his brother's house, but they picked up sleeping bags and clothes. And that's when Jeff told Jody, "We're going. I'm taking you. We're going to California." The two drove from Gonzales, Louisiana to Port Arthur, Texas, and they stayed the night with Jeff's mom. Back in Baton Rouge, there wasn't immediate panic, just confusion. A delay, a missed check-in. But that confusion then turned into something else. They realized that something was wrong. Calls to Jeff's home went unanswered. Plans didn't line up. And then the realization really hit everyone. Jody's not coming home. What followed was every parent's nightmare. Fear turned into urgency into desperation, and the Plauché family contacted authorities, and soon law enforcement was involved working to track down where Jeff had taken them. Meanwhile, the following day, Jeff took Jody to visit an uncle to borrow money for a bus trip to California. They left the following morning. But something wasn't sitting right with Jeff's mother. She was a little suspicious. She asked for the Plauché family phone number, and shortly after, Jody's mom received a phone call. Jeff's mother told her that they had stayed the night at her home in Port Arthur and that Jeff was supposed to be bringing Jody back to Baton Rouge the following day. While the call brought some reassurance to the family, law enforcement wasn't buying it. See, what the Plauché family didn't know was that Jeff had a prior arrest for child molestation. Police decided to keep that detail from the Plauchés because they believed it would only cause more panic in the moment. But by now, Jeff had to know time was running out. They first stopped in Los Angeles, then took another bus to Anaheim. By the third day, Jeff dyed Jody's platinum blonde hair pitch black in an attempt to disguise him. In California, Jody spent most of his time confined to a motel room, where the abuse continued to escalate over the coming week. All the while, Jeff was trying to stay one step ahead. Then he made a mistake. He had Jody place a collect phone call to his mother, instructing him to say that they were in New York City. But that just didn't make sense to June. She already knew that they had been in Texas, where Jeff's mom lived. They were traveling west. Why would they then turn around and go all the way to the east? So she started asking questions, smart ones. She said, "Jody, do you have a coat? Do you have warm clothes? February in New York is freezing." The local sheriff, Mike Burnett, was there listening closely and taking notes on the other line. And then June asked the question that blew it all open. She simply asked Jody, "What time is it?" And he answered, truthfully. And it was 3 hours behind New York. That's when they knew he was on the West Coast. Jeff realized the mistake and ended the call immediately, but the damage was done. As the call ended, June asked the operator, who came on the line, how much the phone charge was. She said it was $23 and the call had lasted 14 minutes. That's when Sheriff Burnett stepped in. He said to the operator, "We're investigating a kidnapping, and we need to know where that call just came from." The operator traced it, the Samoan Motel, Anaheim, California, room 38. Shortly after, Anaheim police raided the motel, and Jody was finally rescued. It was February 29th. He had been gone a total of 15 days. 15 days of fear, 15 days of isolation, 15 days of abuse. And even though he was finally safe, his story was far from over. Unfortunately for Jody, the ordeal didn't end when he was found. He was immediately pulled into a process no child is prepared for. Interviews by authorities, taken to a hospital for forensic exams, and then transferred to the Albert Sutton Home for Abused and Neglected Children. In the early hours of March 1st at 1:15 a.m., 11-year-old Jody Plauché was finally put on a plane back to Louisiana. Home. But even that homecoming was brief. He was reunited with his mother for only a few moments, long enough for her to try and wash the black dye out of his hair. And then the Baton Rouge Police Department stepped in to question him. But Jody refused to speak. Later, he would explain why. Before everything unraveled, he had made a promise to Jeff Doucette that he would never tell on him. And even after everything, he intended to keep his promise. But Jody also understood something. He knew the doctors in California had already conducted those exams. He knew that there would be evidence. So he made a decision. He would wait. Wait until the truth came from somewhere else, until the test said it first, and then he would agree. When that interview ended, investigators were left with a conclusion that couldn't have been more wrong. They told June and either Jeff never touched him or Jody has been too deeply manipulated to ever admit to what happened to him. With Jody finally safe, attention turned to Jeff Doucette. He was arrested in California and charged, but he wouldn't stay there because the crimes of kidnapping and abuse had ties back to Louisiana, and the state wanted him returned to face charges. That process is called extradition, and it doesn't happen overnight. There were hearings, paperwork, legal coordination between California and Louisiana authorities. Doucette was held in custody while the courts approved his transfer, giving him time to consult with attorneys and formally contest things, though in most cases like this, the outcome is often inevitable. Still, though, it took time, almost 2 weeks. 2 weeks where Doucette sat in a cell, waiting to be sent back to Louisiana, and those 2 weeks, Gary Plauché was left with something else entirely. Time to think. Time to replay everything that had happened over the past year. Things that had been done to his son, what Jody had endured, how he had trusted Jeff with the most precious thing in his life, his children. About a week after Jody returned home, the results of the rape kit came back. Sheriff Mike Burknett sat down with the Plauché family and delivered the confirmation no parent ever wants to hear. Spermatozoa had been found on the rectal slide. It was no longer a suspicion, no longer a possibility. This was proof. And with that proof, Jody Plauché finally spoke, corroborating not only what happened in California, but the abuse that had been going on since 1983. For Gary, that moment changed everything. He wasn't just a father waiting for justice anymore. He was a father sitting with undeniable truth, forced to face exactly what had been done to his son, the rage, the grief, the helplessness, and the knowledge that the man responsible was still alive, still breathing, and still protected by a system that expected him to wait. Gary had been a sergeant in the Armed Force. Gary had been a sergeant in the Air Force. He had connections. He knew where law enforcement and retired officers gathered, and he made a point to start showing up. One night at a local bar frequented by cops, he overheard something that caught his attention. An employee from the local ABC affiliate was talking about Jeff's extradition. Gary listened. Then he moved closer. And before the night was over, he had convinced the employee to share the details, when Jeff would be brought back to Baton Rouge and how it was going to happen. With that information in hand, Gary decided he would have his vengeance. See, Gary wasn't just heartbroken. He was consumed, furious in a way he had never experienced before, blinded by this righteous anger. That night, he put a .38 revolver in his boot, and he went to the airport to wait. Stood by that payphone block, blended in, called a friend, and watched as the local news crews began to gather, cameras ready for the arrival of the pedophile. And then just moments before it happened, Gary said quietly into the phone, "Here he comes. You're about to hear a shot." And then Jeff walked past him. Gary turned, raised the gun, and fired. The bullet struck the right side of Jeff Doucette's face, and he crumpled to the ground. Chaos erupted. The officers rushed almost instantly, one of them even a close friend of Gary. As that friend placed him under arrest, he just asked, "Why, Gary? Why'd you do it?" And Gary's answer was simple. If somebody did it to your kid, you'd do it too. Jeff Doucette died from his injuries the following day, and a single moment captured on camera, everything changed. In the immediate aftermath, there was no special treatment. Gary Plauché was arrested on the spot, taken into custody, and processed like anyone else. Booked, detained, brought before a judge. The system moved forward exactly as it was designed to. And inside, Gary sat in a cell, just another man accused of murder. But outside, oh, things were different. Within hours, the footage of the murder was everywhere. That shooting, captured on multiple cameras, was replayed again and again. First local broadcasts, then national news, and eventually around the world. Viewers watched in shock as an ordinary airport turned into a killing in a matter of seconds. That moment, Gary stepped forward, the gun raised, one single shot. It became one of the most recognizable clips in true crime history, long before viral videos and social media. This was a moment that spread the old-fashioned way, through television, repetition, and raw emotional impact. And with every replay, the reaction grew louder. Some were outraged. A man had been executed in public on camera. But other people felt something different entirely. Sympathy, empathy, understanding. Because they didn't just see a shooter. They saw a father. Support for Gary began to build almost immediately. Calls flooded radio stations. People wrote letters. Strangers spoke out, not to deny what he had done, but to defend why he had done it. And the media leaned in. Debates erupted across the country. Is this murder or is it justice? The legal system would decide his fate, but in the court of public opinion, the country had already decided. Gary was innocent. In the weeks after the shooting, the focus shifted from what Gary had done to what would happen to him. He was formally charged with second-degree murder. On paper, the case was pretty straightforward. The act had been captured on camera. There were witnesses. There was no question about who pulled the trigger. But this case was never going to ever be just about the facts. From the beginning, Gary's defense centered on something deeper than legality, his state of mind. His attorneys argued that he was experiencing overwhelming emotional distress, a breaking point brought on by the abuse of his son, and learning exactly what happened after the rape kit. They leaned into the concept of temporary insanity, not in the traditional sense of detachment from reality, but as a man pushed beyond his psychological limit. A father who just snapped. And outside the courtroom, the public was forming its own opinion too. Support for Gary surged during his trial. Many people just couldn't see a criminal. They only saw a parent who had been failed by a system, someone who acted out a kind of raw protective instinct. Why was Jeff Doucette even allowed to work with children in the first place, considering he'd already been arrested for child molestation in the past? Other people, however, were deeply unsettled. They kept saying, if this was justified, where do we draw the line? The case became less about one man and more about a national conversation. When it finally came time for sentencing, the outcome reflected that national tension. Gary Plauché did not receive prison time. Instead, in November of 1984, he was given a suspended 5-year sentence and placed on probation for 5 years, along with 300 hours of community service and mandatory counseling. Gary completed his service by the end of 1985. Legally, Gary was very guilty, but in the eyes of many, especially his own community, he had already been forgiven. The impact of what Gary did, though, didn't end at the trial. That footage, raw, immediate, impossible to ignore, it did more than just document a crime. It shaped how people felt about it. Watching it unfold in real time made it personal. Viewers weren't just hearing about a case, they were witnessing a father's breaking point, and that changed everything. Long before social media, before shares and algorithms, this was one of the earliest examples of true crime virality. This clip was played over and over, embedded itself into public consciousness. And with every replay, sympathy grew. But it wasn't a faceless crime. This was a narrative people understood. A child harmed, a system moving too slowly, and a parent taking action. For many, Gary Plauché didn't represent lawlessness. He represented justice that the system didn't always deliver, let alone deliver fast enough. And in that moment, something shifted. The idea of the vigilante, of taking justice into your own hands, became for some not just understandable, but acceptable. Even now, Decades later, that footage still circulates, still sparks debates, still divides people, because it forces the same uncomfortable question. When the system fails, who gets to decide what justice looks like? Psychologically, this case sits in a gray area that makes people very uncomfortable. Because Gary Plauché wasn't just reacting to what had been done to his son, he was also confronting what had been done to him. Jeff didn't just groom Jody. Remember, he groomed the entire family, earned their trust, positioned himself as safe and helpful, and Gary had allowed that access. That realization was devastating for him as a parent. The guilt, the second guessing, the quiet, relentless question, how did I not see this? That kind of psychological weight doesn't just sit quietly. It builds and layered with anger, with grief, and the need to protect, the knowledge that that protection came too late. Legally, cases like this are often framed as crimes of passion, an act driven by overwhelming emotion rather than cold calculation. But Gary's actions complicate that definition. He didn't act in a sudden chaotic moment. He waited and planned and positioned himself in the perfect place to take that shot, which raises a difficult question. Can something be both premeditated and driven by emotional rupture? Can a person plan an act and still be psychologically overwhelmed when they carry it out? That's where the line blurs. Because Gary wasn't detached. He wasn't indifferent. He was consumed by the trauma, the rage, and the love for his child. And that's what makes this case difficult. It doesn't really fit into right or wrong. So the question becomes, what would you do if you were in Gary's shoes? In the years that followed, life didn't simply return to normal for the Plauché family. After serving his probation, Gary stepped away from the headlines, but not from the impact of what happened. Over time, he began speaking publicly about child abuse, using his story as a warning to other parents about grooming, trust, and how easily predators can embed themselves inside a family's life. He was never trying to justify what he did. He just wanted to make sure that other families might not have to face the same reality. He lived the rest of his life largely out of the spotlight, surrounded by family, carrying both the weight of his actions and the love that drove them. And on October 21st, 2014, he died after suffering a stroke. For some, he is remembered as a man who crossed the line. For others, as a father who did what many only imagine. And then there's Jody. Surviving something like this doesn't end with the headlines. The trauma, the manipulation, the public attention, it all leaves a lasting imprint. But Jody chose a different path forward. Initially, he struggled with Jeff's death. He was only 11 years old, and his feelings were complicated. Friends and family told him not to watch the news or read the papers, but he did anyway, and he grieved. I did not want Jeff killed. I felt like he was going to go to jail, and that was enough for me. Both June and Gary were careful not to push him too quickly. He needed time to process everything on his own terms. And part of that burden was unique. Jody didn't just hear about what happened. He saw it. 2 days later, he watched his father shoot someone he once trusted and loved on the 5 o'clock news. That kind of experience leaves layers. Jody had to work through the cognitive dissonance of loving his teacher but not the abuse, grieving the death of someone he called a friend while knowing he deserved to go to prison, and feeling anger toward his father for turning something so private into something so public. Remember, Jody was just 11 years old. There had been so much coercive control from Jeff that even before the kidnapping, Jody had started avoiding spending time with his own father because Jeff would become jealous and get upset with him. That's just so much for a child to carry. But over time, Gary and Jody found their way back to each other, falling into a familiar rhythm by the following summer. Today, Jody is 67 years old. He's a sexual abuse awareness activist, author, and former sexual assault counselor. His entire adult life was dedicated to educating others about grooming, abuse, and the long-term psychological effects survivors carry. His voice has become a part of a larger conversation, one focused not just on vengeance, but on prevention and awareness. Because what happened to him didn't just affect a moment in time. It reshaped his family. And even now, decades later, the ripple effect remains. That trauma, the healing, the memories, they don't disappear really ever. They start to evolve. And in 2026, this case still lives on. Not because of what happened in an airport, but because of what it revealed about trust, trauma, and the complicated reality of justice. Some stories end with a verdict. This one never really did. And maybe the hardest part of this story isn't what happened, but what it asks of you. Because it forces you to sit with the questions that don't have easy answers. Is justice defined by the law or by emotion? Should a person's intent matter more than the action itself? And when the suffering of a victim is undeniable, does that change how we should judge the crime or the punishment that comes with it? It's easy to have principles in theory. It's so much harder when those principles are tested by something so personal. So where do you draw the line? And if you were standing in Gary's place, would you make a different choice? In a single second, Gary Plauché became both a killer and to many a protector, a man who crossed the line, a man who in the eyes of some never should have had to. And maybe that's why this story still lingers, because it doesn't give a clean ending. There are no easy answers, just a moment, one decision that forces you to confront what you believe about justice, about love, and about the limits of both. The truth always leaves a trail, and sometimes it leads us somewhere we're not prepared to go. This has been When Killers Get Caught. I'm Brittany Ransom. You can find me on TikTok covering short cases, and I'm always open to fan submissions. Send me an email at caseclosersubmissions@gmail.com. And I'll see you all next week.